On a cold, freezing night in Milwaukee, December 10th, 2003, Curtis Harris was arrested in his home on a routine disorderly conduct charge, handcuffed, then punched in the face and shoved in the mud by former Milwaukee police officer Kevin Harris. Dragged to the Milwaukee police jail, Curtis walked into the Milwaukee booking room where his life changed forever when Clark deliberately and maliciously used excessive force, throwing Curtis headfirst into a concrete wall for no reason whatsoever, rendering him a quadriplegic for the rest of his life. Today, the Insider Exclusive will show you the actual Milwaukee police surveillance camera video in the booking room, which completely contradicted the lies of Clark and his fellow officers. How Clark and his fellow officers taunted, ridiculed, and laughed at Harris as he lay paralyzed by Clark on the cold cement jailhouse floor, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. How the wheels of justice turn in police brutality cases like Curtis's. How Jason Abraham of the law firm of Hupy and Abraham got some justice for Curtis Harris. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the Hupy and Abraham law firm. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the two attorneys on this case. Jason Abraham, welcome to the show. Todd Korb, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about this whole case, because it is horrible.
Well, it's about as bad as it gets. It's a police officer gone wrong. What happens is, on the night of this terrible incident, my client is in police custody. At the home, when he's initially arrested, the police are roughing him up. They throw him in the mud, and this continues on back into the booking room, where they ultimately throw him headfirst into a tile wall and render him a quadriplegic.
And when you say throw him into the wall, we're going to be showing some of this jailhouse video. This is actually taken by the surveillance camera in the booking room, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's so galling because the officer at the time of this incident knew this room was being videotaped. So he knew that his actions were put on videotape. He still grabs my client, although my client is completely cooperating with him, and throws him headfirst into a wall. And the worst part is after that, the taunts that occur after my client is moaning over and over again that he can't move his arms and his legs.
They just didn't believe him, did they?
They didn't. I mean, and it's ridiculous because he sees the tile wall there. My client says he can't feel his arms and his legs, and they cuss at him. They call them female body part names, and they just say you're trying to win an Academy Award.
Yeah. When was it that they realized they had a real serious injury on their hands?
You know, I think after a few minutes with my client going in and out of consciousness, he said he couldn't move. They picked him up and actually tried to put him in a chair, even though he said he couldn't move his arms and his legs.
Yeah.
He falls out of the chair. I think the light bulb then goes on at that point. Maybe something a little more serious is going on. But when they call the fire department to come, and they come right away, the first thing they say to them is he's trying to win an Academy Award. Mm-hmm. So I don't even think the fire department personnel at first even believe that something real serious is going on.
Then they transported him to the hospital, because in the video it ends at that point. But they transported him to the hospital, and that's when they realized what had been done?
They did, and I think Todd can comment a little bit about what happens after he goes to the hospital.
By him having he was basically thrown headfirst into the concrete wall. When that happened, his head, his whole spine was compressed.
Yes.
And the vertebrae actually compressed one of the discs that are in between the vertebrae, and retropulsed it. Basically means shot it out of where it should have been, pushed it into the spinal cord, putting such pressure on the spinal cord that it caused the spinal cord injury and his paralysis.
I understand that this whole series of events happened because the police were called. His sister had actually called the police and said that they arrested him for disorderly conduct.
Right.
Some minor thing.
Right. What happened was that Mr. Harris had been drinking, and his sister had a no drinking policy at her house. They got into a verbal altercation. She was frustrated and she called the police. Once the police arrived, Kevin Clark immediately started to get violent with Mr. Harris, and ultimately then took him into custody. They said he was being disorderly at the time, so they arrested him for disorderly conduct, and he also had an outstanding warrant for a traffic fine. Yeah. So clearly nothing type arrest for very minor things.
Yeah, I read that his room that he rented from his sister was, I think, on the 3rd level of the house. if I remember correctly. Second level. They went up to his room. He was in the room. He was watching TV. Yeah. They told him to get up. He got up. Officer Clark, former Officer Clark, he's been fired subsequently, handcuffed him and punched him in the face. That's what I've read. Is this true?
Well, you'd have to ask Kurtz, but I mean, his allegation is that he actually was thrown on the ground and forcibly by Mr. Clark, and then handcuffed and yanked up from the floor by the handcuffs.
And then as he was walking down the stairs, they kept pulling, Officer Clark kept pulling him up by the handcuffs, which is kind of painful.
Well, not only was it painful, but it left permanent scars on his wrists even today. You know, the officers denied that they ever did that with the handcuffs, but the scars speak for themselves.
Police officers usually don't act this way, do they?
They do not.
There are some bad apples in every group, aren't there?
Yeah, and we look at this as an isolated incident from one bad cop. I mean, obviously, the rest of the police force here doesn't want there to be a bad cop, just like we don't want there to be a bad cop. So we don't look at this as any view on the Milwaukee Police Department. This is just one bad officer.
There was a number of witnesses when he was taken outside the house before he got to the police station, where they saw the police officer throw him into the mud. Is that true?
That's right.
And today we have with us one of those witnesses. I think her name is Mercedes Dickerson.
That's correct.
And she's going to join us on the show right now. I'm very pleased to have with us today Mercedes Dickerson. Welcome to the show. I understand that Curtis Harris is your uncle, right?
Yes.
And you saw him the day that he was arrested at your aunt's house, correct?
My grandmother's.
Your grandmother. What did you see exactly?
They told him to get on the ground. They seen that he was finna get on the ground, so they grabbed him by his shirt and put him on the ground and put their knee to his spine and going down the stairs, pushing him down the stairs. So we ran on the balcony. They told him that he liked mud, pushed him in the mud, and slapped him with the leather gloves.
Did they say anything to him?
They asked him, did he like mud?
And then what happened after that?
They walked him to the car and pushed him in the car.
Okay. This isn't the right way to treat anybody, is it?
No.
You know, it took a lot of courage, you know, for Mercedes to be willing to stand up and talk about what she saw in light of what happened with this officer. You know, she gave a deposition and had to be confronted by the city attorney. You know, so she really took a lot of courage for this young woman to be able to come in and give her version of what she saw.
Well, we're all proud of you for doing that. It was the right thing to do. Well, I want to thank you very much for being on the program, and good luck to you. By the way, I understand that you found out about this videotape that the officers had in their booking room kind of by accident, right?
We did, actually. An open records request was made after the incident for any videotape because Mr. Harris was told by Internal Affairs that there was, in fact, a videotape, and the city initially denied that there was such a videotape.
When you say the city, who in the city denied that?
Well, the city attorney's office. When you make the request in this type of case, it goes through the city attorney's office, and they denied any such video existed at first. And then we informed them that Internal Affairs told us that there was in fact a video, and then finally it was produced. You know, in this case, after something this dramatic happens, Internal Affairs takes a look at the officer's conduct. In this case, they did that. We were able to review all those materials, and it was clear that what they did was skew the investigation in a way to make sure that no criminal charges were filed against Mr. Clark. They presented all the evidence in a way that said Mr. Harris punched Mr. Clark, or attempted to, before he was thrown headfirst into a wall. And that clearly didn't happen, and that also was not on the videotape.
But the city attorney's office was aware of the videotape.
Well, they sure should have been, because Internal Affairs was aware of it, and that is also
and they had watched it.
Internal Affairs had watched it.
So how can they allow city employees to lie? I like to use that word lie. How can they allow them to lie and deny the existence and actually what happened? How does that happen?
You know, who knows? You know, but without the videotape, there probably is no case here.
Any repercussions against the city employees that lied about the existence of the tape?
No, because they act like they really didn't know there was a tape, and then they produce it, so they act like no harm, no foul.
Yeah. Civil rights cases in general are pretty tough cases. You just mentioned without the videotape, no case. Tell our audience a little bit about what constitutes a good civil rights case. What are your civil rights? What can't police do?
Well, they cannot use unreasonable force, which the law is really skewed in favor of the police officers in these cases. Most of them, over 90% of these cases, are kicked by the judge at summary judgment because you have to basically prove to the judge, even before you get to a trial, that no reasonable officer would have done what the officer did.
Right.
So the actual actions of the officer. You have experts. We hired an expert in this case to comment on the officer's use of force. But the ultimate issue is whether the force used by the officer was unreasonable. Because
in this case, you had two other police officers who basically corroborated Officer Kevin Clark's statements that he was acting in self-defense.
Right. It's called the code of silence. You see that a lot amongst police officers. Yeah. In this case, the other two officers in the room. Keep in mind, we're at a locked booking room at a police station where they didn't even have Mr. Harris in handcuffs. No threat whatsoever to the officers, complying with all their requests.
Right. We're going to go back to that videotape to show that. So keep talking.
Yeah. I mean, it's you can see that the officer asks Mr. Harris, "Put your arms up." As he's walking towards that desk, he complies. His hands are up. He's then pushed from behind by Officer Clark, and then he looks over his shoulder to see what's going on, and then the next thing, he's violently thrown into a wall.
Right.
It's clear by looking at this videotape that Mr. Harris never threw a punch, but yet after this incident happened, the other two officers in the room corroborate the same lie that Mr. Harris threw a punch.
Now, when Kevin Clark threw Curtis Harris into the wall, they refer to that as a Starsky. Is that a common police term?
My understanding is from a former Milwaukee Police Department officer that is slang for taking a suspect and throwing him down to the ground. It's from the Starsky and Hutch show.
I didn't watch the show that much. Did they used to do that a lot, or what?
I didn't watch the show much either.
Now, getting back to the civil rights laws, okay? These apply to any law enforcement officer, right? They're federal laws, correct?
Yes.
And you can't use excessive force. You have to respect a person's rights. Generally, police officers do that, don't they?
Yes.
But in these cases of egregious behavior, then that's why we have this case to begin with, okay?
Correct. And even with this video, the city attorney's position all along until shortly before trial was that they were not responsible. They were going to beat summary judgment. Their only offer on the case up until it was resolved for $3 million was $500,000.
Yeah.
I mean, they felt that this case was going to get kicked on summary judgment. I mean, it was fought tooth and nail with experts, and the case was set to be tried on October 15th of this year, and we were ready, willing, and able with our briefcases set to walk up there and try this case.
And that's important because your law firm is always ready, willing, and able to try any case, right?
Absolutely.
In other words, you're not looking for a quick settlement. You want the maximum for your client, right? What they deserve.
Absolutely. Now, in this case, obviously, this happened in 2003. It didn't resolve itself until this year, so it took a lot of time to get this case to settle. The city was never going to pay a fair buck until every single hurdle was overcome by us, which we were able to do. And quite honestly, I think Todd and I were both surprised that the case even settled. We fully anticipated that we would have to go into court and try the case. The city offered $3 million, which sounds like a lot of money. In the scope of what Mr. Harris is going to have to live with the rest of his life, it's not a huge sum of money, but it's enough money that it will change the quality of his life. And as a result, we just couldn't take that gamble that we would go into court and have a small percentage we thought of chance of losing and then not have this ability to change the quality of Mr. Harris's life.
Yeah, let's talk about that quality of life because we have a video right now which shows the current condition of Curtis Harris. And he is a quadriplegic, but he's a specific kind of quadriplegic. What is that?
Well, he is an incomplete quadriplegic, and what that means, unfortunately, in his situation, is that he cannot use all four limbs of his body, but he feels pain 24/7. So he's lost the ability to walk. He can move his arms, but he cannot move his fingers. but he feels pain 24 hours a day.
So he has to take a lot of pain medicine, pain medication to blunt that pain, correct?
Correct.
Okay, let's go to that video right now.
Good morning. We're going to do a routine. We're going to walk through Mr. Harris' AM routine. When I get here, first thing I'll do in the morning is wash my hands, get his 8 o'clock meds, which he'll put it in his mouth himself. I'll give him some water. Mr. Harris is placed on his chair where there's a bucket placed under him with water in the bucket for his bowel program. Sometimes you have to do digital stimulation. He's not able to push and function with his digestive system. Which one? The left or the right?
Oh, by here.
But before I go out, I'll swing him around.
TV.
Curtis's life has changed dramatically, as we can see that, and he's never going to get better, is he?
No. Unfortunately, this is a permanent condition that, as far as we know, there's no doctor can help him get any better.
Okay. When you determine, like they came up with the number $3 million, right? Is that based on like a life care plan that you came up with, that the city agrees with, or is that their own estimate?
Well,
where do they get this number? That's what I'm really saying.
It comes from all the different types of damages that you can put forth in this case.
Okay.
Past medical expenses, future medical expenses through a life care plan, past wage loss if there'd be any, future wage loss if there'd be any, and then you have past and future pain and suffering. So we put forth all the damages that we could put forth to the city. Then the case settled with a federal magistrate at mediation, where the magistrate tried to get both parties together to reach a reasonable settlement. So the $3 million, is obviously based on all the special damages that we could put forth, and then I guess the city's determination of a cost-benefit analysis of what's the likelihood of a bigger verdict, and then ultimately for us it came down to we could really change Curtis Harris's life by this settlement, and we felt compelled to recommend that the case get settled.
I read in your recommendation that you thought a jury verdict might come in at $6 million plus in that neighborhood.
Correct.
And someone pointed out, and I think this is important for our audience, that Curtis had a criminal record. He had been arrested for various other things, not major things, but that was figured in, and that's what I was amazed at, the statistics of how much he might have received, had he gone to trial.
Well, you have to factor in the credibility of all witnesses when you determine whether you're going to go to trial. In this case, as you mentioned earlier, Officer Clark was fired for an unrelated incident. Right after this incident with Curtis Harris, he was sledding on duty and was fairly seriously injured, and he and his other officers at the time concocted this scam where they would say he was injured while chasing a suspect. He received workers' compensation benefits, actually I think was even given an accommodation from the mayor, and then months later another officer rolled over and said no, they were sledding on duty, and then he was charged with the crime and ultimately fired. So the credibility...
Charged and convicted.
Correct.
Insurance fraud.
Exactly. And the credibility of all witnesses have to be determined into settlement decisions. For example, the city thought they were going to be able to keep out all this information about Officer Clark's subsequent incident and insurance fraud. We were able to successfully convince the judge that his credibility is at issue in this case, so therefore this goes to his character for truthfulness and it should be in. The judge agreed. One of the reasons the city then decided to pay a substantial sum of money was because they realized that all that information about Clark was going to come before the jury. So when they had to assess his credibility, they were going to be looking at this incident with respect to sledding, what happened at the house, Mercedes' testimony about throwing him in the mud, all these building blocks into showing that Officer Clark was just a bad cop.
There was a big contention about what Officer Clark, former Officer Clark, and his two officer buddies said happened in that booking room, and we fortunately have with us a video deposition of Officer Clark, former Officer Clark, trying to explain his way out of what definitely appears to be excessive force, and we're going to go to that right now.
Curtis Harris down, you're trying to get him down to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get him down to the ground?
Yes.
Okay. Did Mr. Harris, or did you decentralize Mr. Harris into something other than the floor before he got down to the floor?
He struck the base of the north wall with his head.
Has ever lost consciousness after he, at least in your presence, after he was injured?
That's correct. He never lost consciousness in my presence.
In
fact, I've heard several instances on here where he's speaking rather clearly.
Let's pause there. Can you hear someone say, "Now you can breathe, now you can talk, oh busted"?
You can talk, oh busted?
Yeah, now you can breathe, now you can talk, oh busted. Did you hear that phrase used?
It sounded like it, yes.
Was that your voice? I'm just going to stop here at 3:19:24. You hear some laughter?
Yeah, there appeared to be several people laughing.
Okay, but you're saying you did not laugh?
I don't recall. I couldn't hear what was said.
That's amazing to watch him try to explain his way out of something that's blatantly use of excessive force. What are your comments on this?
Well, see, this Officer Clark had previously in written reports indicated that Mr. Harris had thrown a punch at him with his right fist. Well, when Mr. Harris is facing the opposite direction, Officer Clark is directly behind him. You can see from the actual videotape of the incident that it's impossible for Mr. Harris to throw out a punch.
Unless he can punch backwards.
Yeah, and so when they acted it out, I was really surprised that they even wanted to demonstrate it. So they must have actually thought about how they were going to explain this in their deposition. And he and Officer Shanky, one of the other officer who was present throughout that night with Mr. Harris, when they acted it out and showed something totally opposite of what you see on the actual video, it was really striking to me. And it was also interesting, even after that, those depositions were taken. The actual sergeant who they gave the use of force, their initial explanation of how this happened, they told him how it happened. I took his deposition, and then when he tried to explain what happened, what he was shown by Mr. Officer Clark, he said the punch was like this. Like a backwards, over the back, backwards punch. It was just amazing to see these officers try and concoct this story.
I got to say this: they're not stupid. I mean, they've all seen the video.
Well,
how can they try to say anything other than what seems rationally the case?
That's the funny part about what happened in the depositions. Is most lawyers, when you're preparing your client for a deposition, you don't want to show them anything in advance. Because they can be asked by the other lawyer, what did you look at in advance of the deposition? Then that's discoverable to the other lawyer. So the city attorney in this case did not show the videotape to the officers in advance.
But the city attorney knew what was on the tape.
But knew it was on the tape. So after it was over...
They set themselves up.
Yeah, it's funny because after it was over, the officer made a comment to Todd saying, I knew I should have watched that videotape, because then during the deposition... he was obviously shown what happened in the videotape, and his testimony then he knew at that time was compromised by what the actual video showed.
It would seem to me that if you're an officer, how long had Clark been an officer? A number of years, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It would seem to me that they are aware that this video camera is in the booking room. One of the first things that I would think, if I was involved, I was trading places with him, would be, what do we do about that videotape? Because I'm sure there's instances where all of a sudden the video camera wasn't working, right?
We were quite surprised that there was a videotape and very happy we had a copy of it. I mean, obviously, when there's a police report that says my client threw a punch at an officer, if all we had was the report showing a punch was thrown and my client saying no, it wasn't, that would be a very, very difficult case. But that videotape showing the truth of what happened that night, was the single piece of evidence most important to get the case resolved.
Kevin Clark, as you said earlier, was eventually convicted of insurance fraud.
He was.
Right. And did he do any jail time?
No.
Okay. Was anybody else reprimanded at the Milwaukee Police Department for this unfortunate event?
For the Curtis Harris incident? Yeah. No, unfortunately not. As I said, Internal Affairs did an investigation. Nothing in that report talked about what happened back at Curtis's sister's house.
Yeah.
It was all done in a way that showed Mr. Harris threw a punch everything was skewed in that way. So when they brought it to the district attorney's office to review, the district attorney's office decided not to charge Officer Clark with anything as a result of this incident.
Generally, internal affairs exist in any law enforcement to determine what the truth is, right? But generally, if you lie to internal affairs, isn't that grounds to be dismissed?
It is, and you know what happened is the internal affairs officer, when he did his investigation, looked at the videotape himself and said it was inconclusive as to whether or not Curtis Harris threw a punch. So it seemed to us, at least, that there was a code of silence that not only started in the booking room, but had gone through then to internal affairs in a way to kind of sugarcoat what happened here.
Now, this, I understand, was the biggest settlement that the city of Milwaukee has paid in police brutality cases, isn't it?
It is, and it's also, we believe, the biggest settlement in a police brutality case in the state's history.
And unfortunately, Curtis Harris is living proof of it now, isn't he?
He is, unfortunately.
What kind of advice do you give viewers if they think they might have a civil rights case? What is the criteria that they should look at?
Well, they certainly should try and find an attorney who handles civil rights cases.
Yeah.
And immediately try and get in touch with that attorney so that that attorney can get to work on securing evidence so they can try and establish a case.
I would say that these civil rights cases are very, very difficult cases. And the city, whatever city you're in, or the governmental entity, fights these cases tooth and nail.
Yeah.
So in order to have, unfortunately, a viable civil rights case, you have to have big damages, because these cases can cost thousands and thousands of dollars to fund, hiring experts, doing depositions. So unfortunately, to bring these cases, in a lot of circumstances, the injuries have to be fairly significant.
You took lots of hours of deposition of Kevin Clark, didn't you?
We did.
Did he hold up well during the whole thing?
I sure don't think so. I mean, to me, when you watch the videotape, it shows him, in my mind, to be just a liar.
Okay.
Well, it's interesting, his character. Just before I began the deposition, he actually walked up to me because he had seen me once before, because we had tried, there was a scheduling mishap, and we had seen him, I'd seen him the week before. And he walked up to me and he actually said, I'm surprised to see you wearing a different suit. I figured you'd only own one suit. So he
Why is that?
Just insulted me. And then he went in and he, in my opinion, buried himself.
Yeah. And it's I think important to note to the audience that this officer showed not 1 ounce of remorse to what he did to Curtis Harris from the day of the incident up until the time of settlement. And then the deposition, when it was talked about the sledding incident and the fact that he lost his job, he cried like a baby over losing his job. But when it comes to rendering someone a quadriplegic, there was no remorse whatsoever.
Well, maybe his payment is yet to be due. Huh?
We can only hope.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being on the show, Todd.
Thank you.
And
thank you so much.
It's great having you on the program, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at www.insiderexclusive.tv.